but I think that the companies based in Europe perhaps see the writing on the wall, and so they're proactively trying to obtain these terms in their contracts at this time.
But let me, in September, the Houston Strategy Forum will host an energy transition symposium right after your global gas and LNG symposium. Tell me, are you seeing a shift in where the company, the firm and industry as well? Are you seeing more energy transition? Is there more money being spent on new energy type of projects than the normal traditional type of projects?
Sure. Well, certainly, I think in the last year or two, we've seen a lot of the dialogue in terms of discussing new types of energy. It's like hydrogen, for example.
Yes.
The dialogue has certainly increased significantly. The investments have increased and the projects have increased compared to where they were before that. Now, compared to other types of energy projects, I'd say it's still a smaller part of the energy economy.
Okay.
So we're still seeing a lot of traditional oil and gas work going on, but some of that work now is coupled with proposals like carbon capture, for example.
Yes.
And then we do see the new the developments, especially in the hydrogen area and some of the other renewables.
And so this ESG considerations that companies, I guess the pandemic has accelerated the focus on ESG aspects of a project. From a legal point of view, how does that factor in? Which are the parties who are going to be responsible for ESG? Is that within the corporation? Is it outside the corporation? Do your developers and the contractors, the EPC contractors, or the builders of the plants, is there a new clause? How does the legal agreements now change because of ESG factors?
Sure. So there's really two drivers in the ESG area. It's really either a company just deciding that it wants to set its own goals,
yes,
for emissions and so forth, and then we also have companies who are subject to regulation and are required to meet specified goals. And so, for example, in the EU, where there is actual regulation involved, that is driving some of the requirements potentially of the companies that are in the EU to begin to think more about their contracts with natural gas and LNG suppliers, and for them to seek through those contracts to seek provisions with the suppliers for arrangements as how they will address ESG issues. But it's really purely a contractual matter. And then also, of course, if a company just has its own ESG goals, it's really, again, it's a contractual matter as to what it wants to achieve in its contracts with other parties.
So have clients been calling you this year, or your firm, and asking for specific ESG guidance, right? Maybe in their contracts, but even in their other corporate affairs, have you seen an uptick in the need for ESG related work?
Yes, actually, we definitely have. So we're seeing LNG client companies who are interested in selling what's called green LNG or low carbon LNG. And so the way that the LNG is made to be of lower carbon content is by essentially using carbon offsets. Okay. And so those carbon offsets are retired in connection with those with the delivery of those cargoes. And so we are seeing negotiations now where those contracts include clauses where the parties discuss who has an obligation to obtain the offsets, who will retire them, and then how much each of the parties will pay for the offset of those those offsets. But again, it's completely something that's been agreed by the parties that they want to do together. It's it's not yet something imposed or required by a governmental authority.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. What seems to be the driver? Is the driver companies' own volition, where they say we want to be more ESG compliant, or is it regulation? And you look in EU, it is the actual judicial system which is forcing companies to go back to the drawing board and look at their ESG exposure. Here in the US, and actually your global team, what do you think is the biggest driver? Is it companies' own desire to be a carbon low footprint?
Right. That's right. In the EU, while there are some, there's been some court cases and there are developments in the EU legislation and recent directives. Those haven't quite yet reached the level where they mandate these
Right.
terms, but I think that the companies based in Europe perhaps see the writing on the wall, and so they're proactively trying to obtain these terms in their contracts at this time. But as far as others, like in the US and elsewhere, it's really just like you said, it's really companies who, for their own reasons, maybe it's driven by shareholders
Yes.
or management, but they have their own reasons that they want to try to advance these purposes.
Do you have any sense on what is the economic impact? How much does it increase their costs on a project to start taking into consideration ESG aspects?
It's a fair question. It is, it varies significantly based on several factors. It depends on how you, for example, a cargo of liquefied natural gas, of LNG, how you consume that LNG really affects the carbon emissions of
Yes.
that cargo. And so you have to make a determination as to what the carbon content is of that cargo upon final disposition of it. And then you also have to think about where, if it's through offsets, where the offset's based. I would say generally, I probably won't throw out a number, but I will say that it's enough to make a difference, but it's not, it's still less than 10% of the value of the cargo, for example.
Okay. So maybe the cost is not backbreaker. I mean, they're able to absorb the cost, and then I suspect down the line, it's the consumers who will pay for that additional ESG cost, because somebody has to pay for that.
Right. Somebody has to pay for it, and it's small in relative terms, but often those small amounts are they're the incremental. They go to the incremental profit of the cargo,
Yes.
and so they can have a very real effect on the economics.